Welcome to Cut the Bull, an insightful podcast which addresses the news of the day and the cultural issues plaguing our society, bringing logic and context to these topics and discussing solutions too real for mainstream pundits. Now, here are your hosts, Charles Love, Shamika Michelle, and Wilfred Riley.
Hello and welcome to Cut the Bull. I am Charles Love alongside my co-host Wilfred Riley. Shamika should be joining us shortly. And our guest this week is Aella Girl on Twitter. She is a sex worker and researcher, and we're going to talk about both of those today. Aella, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on.
So obviously, as anyone interviews you or talks about sex work, there's a stigma around it, and people who don't do it and don't travel in that world don't understand it. So I guess we'll briefly talk about that, both from the standpoint of how you got started in it and what some of your thoughts are about it, which will lead to the research. So tell us how you fell into sex work.
Well, I mean, I was working at a factory and it sucked ass. Do not recommend working on a factory floor. And I was like, I don't want to do this with my life. Long story short, I was like desperately looking for any other kind of work, and a friend recommended that I try being a cam girl. And I tried to be a cam girl, and I made a lot of money for me, which was $60 my first night. And I was like, I can do anything. And then I just camped really hard for 5 or 6 years and tried escorting, tried OnlyFans, and now I'm here.
So which of the three were the best between
escorting?
Escorting?
Absolutely. That one's my favorite. It's just because it's like more human, really. Like there's something about the asymmetrical nature of camming and OnlyFans that feels like you're not doing a normal thing. It feels like you're like playing some sort of like annoying video game. Mm-hmm. Whereas escorting is just like the money is like set, and then you just have a human experience with someone for a couple hours, and then you come back. And that felt way healthier to me.
So what was your time from, so I guess it was in that order, cam girl, and then escort, and then OnlyFans?
Yeah.
So what was your the time frame? You said about 5 years is cam, right?
Yeah, 5 or 6.
Okay. And then you went into escorting directly after that?
No, I did like a break because I was getting burned out of camming, and so I went to like a friend's crypto startup, which like didn't end great. And then I was in the crypto startup. I'm like, man, I want to be paid more money. Mm-hmm. I want more money and more freedom. I don't like being told what to do. So I became an escort.
And did you find out about escorting the same way you did cam girling?
Kind of. I had a friend who was an escort, and then like I'd known her for a while, and then eventually I was like, okay, I want to try sex work again because I want money, but I don't want to go back to camming because it's burnout. So I'll just talk to her, and then she talked me through the process of how to do escorting, and then I started. It was great.
And last thing before I let Will in, for the naive and those who don't know, talk a little bit about the differences between the three.
So camming is like a little bit like what we're doing now, but like, and imagine there's a chat on the side, and people, you can talk to the people in the chat. People in the chat can like throw you like virtual money, which is even translatable to real money, and this is how you earn money. So typically it'd be like, hey, if we collectively tip, 2,000 tokens, and I'll take my shirt off. And then if we do even more, I'll start masturbating. This is like sort of the bread and butter of camming. Escorting is you meet in person. You're like, hey, you go on like sort of a pseudo date or not a date at all, depending. And then you have physical sex with the person. They pay you cash, and then you leave, and you're like, hell yeah. And then OnlyFans is kind of like, if you haven't heard about OnlyFans, it's like Facebook kind of, but like if your Facebook feed were locked and you post nudes on it and people had to pay a monthly subscription to access it. And you can do other things like DM people on OnlyFans, exchange tips, buy videos, stuff like that. So it's like the camming is live, OnlyFans is non-live.
Mm-hmm. Will?
Yeah, I mean, so, I'm familiar with all those platforms. I actually recently thought about setting up an OnlyFans. It would just be me doing some esoteric shit, like reading stats papers and criticizing them. And yeah, I actually think people would pay for it, like real talk, but I'm probably not going to do it. I could do that on another platform. But I mean, one of the things that Ella just said that I think is really interesting is you often hear that sex work is kind of demeaning and it sucks. And I've had a bunch of just shitty jobs. Like, I mean, I've also had a bunch of elite jobs, by the way, but I mean, like, I've been like a bouncer in the hood. And I mean, like listening to you describe some of your jobs, it sounds pretty similar. Like you said, you were working on like the actual baseline floor of a factory. You were working in one of those crypto startups with a name like Get It, and nobody was getting paid. I mean, so how would you respond to the claim that sex work is demeaning, or no pun intended, it sucks? Like, how would you contrast that with just a regular, unpleasant job? Like you're going to catch dogs and round them up for the city. Like which would you rather do?
And that pun was intended, by the way.
No, I'd have made a much better joke, but I mean, just like thinking about. There's actually a story about the one time I was asked to be a pimp, essentially clientele manager for an
We've told
escort
it a
agency.
few times. It's perfect for this
I've only told it
episode.
once, and I'm not going to tell it again. It's not needed for this podcast. But I'm interested in how you would contrast. How would you contrast sex work with just not what I think the average upper middle class woman is imagining as a non-demeaning job like lawyer, but with just a regular ass job? Which would you prefer? What are the differences?
Oh, yeah, I mean, like I personally absolutely prefer sex work over any job I've done ever strongly, like 1,000 times. Like sex work would have to get a lot worse before I decided to take a different job. But again, this is personal to me. I do think that there's like an unfair standard, like a double standard applied. Like people are really focused on the downsides of sex work as opposed to other forms of labor. And for a lot of people, this is not a fair comparison. Like for me, I like factory work sucked way more than it did for a lot of other people. And like to be fair, sex work, you do get sort of the social stigma associated with it in a way that doesn't happen when you're doing other kinds of work. Like nobody ever came to me and was like, "Oh man, are you going to be able to find a husband after like learning that I worked in a factory?" Like nobody does that. So there, like to be fair, I think like the demeaning is coming from sort of the social weight that you're carrying. So it does depend. Like if you can handle that social weight, if you're like in circles where it doesn't matter quite as much, then I think it's like much more equivalent to a normal job. But especially if you're in traditional circles or like very sexually conservative circles, it's going to be like, in fact, it's going to actually have a much more demeaning impact because people are going to demean you for it.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. Yeah. That's
Um,
interesting. I mean, that's like what people say about a lot of other things. Sometimes it's valid, sometimes it's not. When people are talking about transgenderism, for example, like, well, the problem is
Yeah.
that other people will criticize you for it. With sex work, that probably actually is true. I
mhm.
feel like that's true as a guy with a lot of jobs, though. Like, if I were working as a fry cook, I actually love to cook. Like, I wouldn't object. I think I would get a lot less female interest if I were a chubby 5'9" fry cook. I mean, in terms of the social reaction there. You never know. But all
Or
right,
if you
fair
worked
enough.
in a job that was traditionally female work, right? If you did,
No, it'd
you know,
just be, why are you making 8.15 an
right?
hour?
No, but I'm
You
saying, but even if
failed
you were
son of a
working at
bitch. It
the
wouldn't be. It would have nothing to do with really the social whatever. I mean,
right, but I'm saying also that same stigma would happen if you were working in a job that was traditionally female. Like if you tell, like I don't know if it still happened now, but I know 15 years ago, if you were like, well, what do you do? Well, I'm a secretary for this guy. You know, I'm this
oh yeah,
guy's
that's true
assistant.
enough.
They'd be like, what? Right? I mean, what are you gonna do when you grow up? Right, that kind of deal.
Yeah, no,
Right,
fair enough.
right.
There's a
So
lot there.
that's definitely true, but also we'll get to the stigma in a minute because that's interesting in some ways. But I like the fact that you say that for you hated those other jobs more, and but a lot of this kind of depends on the person. Like
Hmm.
because I read some of your pieces and you lay it out why it's good. I like you like I don't go into the downside because you know what all the downsides are. But here's some other things. But you do say clearly and honestly, if these type of things bother you and this isn't for you, then you shouldn't do it. It's not like you're because you love it. It's not like you're saying everyone should do it and everybody would love it. You'd have to have a certain kind of personality, right?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Sex work is not for everybody, which is like annoying to me because like people, whenever people criticize me, they're like, "Ayla's trying to get everybody into sex work." I'm like, no, fucking don't. There's absolutely downsides of sex work. That some people don't have a good time with it. Like I have a friend who's an escort, and she had like a really psychologically hard time for it with it for years. Like she would feel like disgusting after she saw clients. Like she would need to, shower a lot. And then recently she figured out how to relate to it differently, like change her mentality, so she no longer feels this, or like she set up like boundaries with the kind of clients she sees or whatever. But like a lot of people just are not set up in a way where it's automatically easy. Like for me, it's like easy. I was like, it's like my first client. I was like, this is incredible. I felt so good, like right from the get go.
Mm-hmm.
But a lot of people don't feel that way. And if you don't feel that way, like you should probably evaluate if this is actually the job for you.
Right, right. Now to the stigma is interesting. So obviously there's a side that people would expect. You know, when you talked about living in a more socially conservative or traditional areas. But do you find, like I said, down the road in a few minutes, we're going to get to your research. So you do a lot, ask a lot of important questions and do some research to find out how people relate to certain things as it pertains to sex. But do you find that a lot of the stuff that people assume, they assume the normal stuff, but it's not consistent? We were talking earlier about people not being consistent. Well, some people will say one thing, but if you really probe, it's the other thing. Obviously, people think the having a problem with it, but it works both ways. Some people can say, I'm totally fine with it, right? I think it's good. Kudos to you. That's wonderful. And then, like you say, they won't date somebody who's done it and things of that nature, right? Or the people say this is morally reprehensible. We see politicians all the time, but then they're, either working in that field, or they are the person who's paying money to an escort, right? So they're saying that it's bad, but it must not be that bad to them because they're, participating in it, or they're saying they don't have a problem with it, but all the way they act indicates they do have a problem with it.
Yeah, it's quite hypocritical. A lot of it.
Right.
But like it's not to be like, people will often like secretly hire escorts and like be very careful not to tell anybody about it. But there's something like the social stigma from dating an escort is like quite low. Like if you like, a lot of people are like, nobody will date you because it's like embarrassing to be dating a woman who everybody knows is banging other men, because like the cuckoldry kind of mentality. So I think like that at least is a little bit more consistent.
Right. But what do you think, lastly, about the stigma as the culture shift? Do you find it interesting that we're in a day? I know we talk about Will mentions transgender, but you talk about same-sex marriage. Everybody should be able to do what they want to do. So this is what's being pushed by larger and growing segment of the population. But they haven't come around on that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting because the culture like web is fascinating, because like the very like progressive thing is like a combination of like women, if I'm going to be like a little uncharitable, and I recognize I'm being uncharitable, like sort of like female superiority a little bit. Like women are going to college at higher rates, and sort of this collection of culture says this is good, right? This is no longer sort of an unequal thing. Like it is positive for women to have higher rates of like college graduations, and sort of this sort of thing is like sort of the woman superiority, and like that is very counter to sex for money, because sex for money is sort of like inherently degrading. It's like giving men power or whatever. So they're very counter it. I think it's like a little bit confusing.
But to the other side, though, I mean, I know there's a stigma, but isn't there also a problem with, maybe you have an answer for this, but I know some will say, not just from a moral standpoint, but they'll say, you like it. You said yourself that that's written. Most people, I mean, you're kind of unique in that sense. There's a group of people who won't have a problem with it. You talked about the friend who was an escort. But then there's also, they would say that, well, everybody's not going to be that, what was it, $1,200? Everybody's going to be not going to be that $1,200 an hour escort and be able to be on OnlyFans and make that much money. So what about those who decide that they might want to get into that type of work and they fall below the averages or run into all these other things?
I mean, like ideally, you'd have like sort of an outline that is a good estimation. You'd be like, okay, like practically speaking, given the amount of hours you can put in, your business sense, and your appearance, like how much actually practically can we think that you would be able to make from sex work? And this is not going to be perfect, but people should be able to decide whether or not that is worth the stigma.
Right.
Like, I think people should be allowed to be paid to take on a stigma if they decide that that is a good trade-off for them. Because you have things like single moms who want to stay at home to like raise their kids, and like sex work is the way to do that from home. They just take nudes and now they can afford that. And like, who are you to tell them that because their pay is too low, like they shouldn't be allowed, or that this is damaging for them? Ideally, you'd be like, all right, single mom, you're going to take on the stigma. You're going to get this amount of money in return.
Right.
It is like not great
that benefit analysis.
Right. So I think ideally there would be more tools to allow people to do this. And in my guides to escorting, or my guides to cam grilling, I try to provide a calculator for you to sort of estimate how much earnings you can achieve. And I think this is outdated now, but this is an example of, I think, the kind of thing that would benefit people in actually making a decision. So
that's probably why but that's probably, I'll go to Will, but that's probably why they think you are trying to coerce women into being a sex worker, because they see that number, even on the low end, I would assume it's a lot higher than the average, right? So that's probably why they're thinking that. But Will.
One question that I have almost at random is when you just said, I forget the exact phrase, but it was something like you should be able to choose to do pretty much what you want to. Like you should be able to choose as a consenting adult to take on stigma if you want to. To me, that seems like some of the more obvious shit that someone said on this show. But I guess my question for you would be even more than on the right, where did kind of the anti-sex through line and feminism come from? Like I was on a Twitter or Facebook or one of these platforms the other day, and I said something really obvious. Like a lot of women like kink too. And this wasn't even like I was talking with like a female friend. It was like I was reading a journal or something just totally lame. And it was just like, who watches porn? This breakdown. And I posted this,
Yeah.
and all these shrieking feminists showed up. Were like, no, any sex with a man is degrading. And this went on for a while. And I was just like, no, it's not. This is a lot of my actual like female friends were just like, no, it's not. This is like what I like. These are my
Yeah.
tastes. And people are literally saying things like, no, the patriarchy has convinced you to like this. It's the sadism of men. There's no way you should volunteer to do this. All sex workers specifically came up. Like all sex workers are people that are playing to the degrading tastes of men. And I found this amusing. And I think that, you know, the people on the people like sex and can consent to it side are pretty easily winning the argument. But how did that become half of the feminist take? What's your thought on that? It really
Yeah.
surprised me the first couple of times I saw this shit, and it's been much more intense the past couple of years to
Yeah, I'm
me.
not sure. Like you could like invent a bunch of frames for it, but like one is sort of like the power arrangement, right? So like if you can, if it's good for you to be able to get thousands of dollars of money out of men for basically existing, this is sort of acknowledging that you have quite a lot of power. Like yes, being sexually attractive and getting men to do what you want is in fact a form of like very intense power. And this really runs counter to the victim narrative, where you're like, like as a woman, male sexual attraction to you like is victimizing you. You are a subject of, you are victim to. You're like, oh God, right? Like sex is not like a positive, fun thing. It is not something that you can win. Sex is almost like necessarily like a losing game. Which is a little sad, a little regressive
Yeah.
because I mean I think this is quite traditional. Like oh, as a woman, if you're having sex, like you're losing some value. And I think it's basically just that thing, but like inserted for a modern audience.
Yeah, the extreme power dynamic argument strikes me personally as just sort of like a childish low IQ variant on trad Marxism. I mean, it seems like virtually anyone could do this. I mean, like as a black man, I am victimized by white women that want to exploit traditional perceptions of my masculinity or something like that. I mean, that take seems about as on point as the things that people were saying about how liking kink as a woman comes from things that men have been forcing into your brain. But no, that's interesting. And the same thing comes up with people arguing that liking wealthy men, for example, or any gaps in age and relationships, anything like this is an unhealthy reflection of differences in power. I don't know. That seems like it would be really awkward to go into sex with someone worrying about that stuff, but you never know, to each their own.
Yeah, I mean, like to some degree, there's a way where like psychosomatic things are not fake. Like people are really afraid of saying something is psychosomatic because it sort of has this connotation that you're inventing the thing. You're like, oh, I'm making it up for attention, which I don't think this is how it is at all. It's like, oh, you're like afraid of, having to like move cities. And so you develop like a chronic stomach ache. It's like you're the brain sort of redirecting anxiety. And I think that this is kind of what's going on when it comes to like trauma around sex or like feeling victimized around sex. Like I don't think that these people are consciously doing some sort of like like I want to feel bad. I think it's just like culture has like been like, okay, this is something that this is a damaging thing, you're supposed to feel bad about it, and it genuinely creates like a psychosomatic trauma. Like these are not like fake traumas, like these are like actually created experiences of real trauma. And so I feel like often like a
You
little
mean
confused about
for
it.
feminists that are trying to find a reason to think sex is bad?
Yeah, I'm saying that their
Huh.
experience of thinking sex is bad is in fact a genuine experience of sex being bad. I think it's like psychosomatic, but it is still genuine.
I don't I don't know if I'd agree. I don't know if there's any way to know that, I guess would be my
Fair.
comment. It seems like a weird to me, it seems like a weird flip of the trad take on sex. So the trad position on sex, I think, grows out of traditional male female differences, like the sexes sort of seeing each other as exotic and dangerous, and women in particular as in need of protection. So the idea was that there are certain things that a good girl just doesn't do. And that grew into this sort of really unhealthy place where a whole bunch of things that many people naturally want to do, both men and women, and this extends to men too, like a man is never submissive, God damn it. A lot of perfectly normal things were just ruled off limits because a certain percentage of people had a problem with them. And that grew out of the natural desires on the one hand and the social roles that kind of logically restrained them on the other. And I think that now, after the sexual revolution became fun but produced a set of problems, you're seeing an attempt by sort of the rad femmes on the exact opposite side to recreate some of those roles like chaperonage. I don't know if the panicked backlash to certain things, like the power of a lot of actual female desires, I don't know if that comes from something that women have actually experienced at
Well,
all. I'd
well,
be
I would
interested in
think it's
checking,
probably.
but I don't know. I don't know that. I think a lot of it's just this strikes me as dirty.
Ooh, I don't know. I think some of it could. I think it's a little of both. I agree with that. Uh,
I think we're all just kind of guessing, honestly. But Charles,
no, I
what's
mean,
up?
but you're also right. As I have no way of proving this either. But I think
I'm just
some of it
bullshitting
does stem.
personally.
It's like the race,
Smart
though.
though.
It stems from the if you believe something, it's like cyclical. If I believe it, and then I think a certain way, and so obviously it's going to manifest the way itself in the way I treat people, the way I act, the way I interact with men, and the way I have relationships. So some of them, obviously not all, but some of these really radical feminists really don't like men, right? So how can
Yeah.
you have, if you're not a lesbian, but you really don't like men, how can you have a fun, healthy sexual relationship with these people that you can't stand? Right.
Well,
So
I think part of that gets into, I mean, like, I think a lot of the people that were in this particular conversation that were saying things like normal men might not necessarily want to go down on women, because I sure know I wouldn't want to be dominated by a man. A lot of these people don't strike me like as people who'd be incredibly fun to sleep with. So you are getting the recreation of those traditional male female roles just from the exact opposite extreme. Like we used to have these rules that were enforced by men that kept men and women away.
mhm.
And we then removed these rules, and men and women had a lot of fun for a couple of decades, but there were a lot of problems, single motherhood, some abusive women. And now we, as the leaders on the female side, are trying to recreate these rules. I don't think just bringing back traditional rules with a different set of parameters is going to work, though, because nobody wants them. You have to figure out what will actually work while letting people do things that people want to do. Shamika's here.
Right. Shamika, sex works, go.
Sex work. So it's
That's a
OnlyFans
great
considered
background.
sex work.
I'll just you don't have to jump right in. No.
I
Some
had some
Africa
questions
Bambata shit
prepared.
You guys, so I'm gonna ask one more question, then I'll let you go. How about that?
Okay.
So Aella, what part do you think? I know I talked about, because we talk, I'm kind of thinking of this in the same way I think of the race and gender, all the cultural wars, because I talk about things in terms of culture, and regardless of what I agree with and don't agree with, I don't think we can legislate ourselves out of any of these problems. We're not going to ban CRT and it's going to go away. We're not going to ban transgenderism and it's going to go away. And whatever your thoughts on sex work's the same. But that said, Will was talking about some of the negative perceptions, and you talking about how you're stigmatized. But another part of it too is how things are portrayed, right? We forget about the power of music and movies and all this kind of stuff. You look at the TV shows, when you now you see it's always some lawyer spending all this money on a high-end girl, right? But in general, it was always girls walking the streets. That's what you would see, right? There's always a pimp. There's always being control. So and I know you and Will agree, and I agree, because I don't think we can legislate stuff that adults should be able to do whatever they want to do. But the concern a lot of people have is that how do we differentiate the women who are doing it willingly from the ones who are not? And that percentage, we're going to get to your stats soon. The percentage may be low, but if they watch the media and the entertainment and the movies and the TV shows, they think it's 96.8% of the people, right? All have pimps and they're all being abused and they're making no money, right? Well, I used to know I think you're sitting on a stack of money right now, but they think that's not the case. So what part do you think that plays in it, and how do you counter it if it plays a large part?
I mean, like a lot of stuff I consider to be more effectively addressed by incentive structuring as opposed to like direct like impact. Like for example, like the drug war. We like things were like kind of bad, and then we put a lot of regulations about it, and now it's like, really bad because like the incentives are really fucked up. And like for example, if you're a woman and you're not making a lot of money through sex work, you have like an incentive to go find a pimp. Like the pimp is providing you a useful service, which is protection against other men. And why do you need a pimp for that? Is because the police aren't going to do it because it's illegal. You have to work on the street because you can't put an online ad because they take the online ads down because it's illegal, right? Like through your inability to protect yourself or to use like good self protective measures, you're forced into a situation where you have to have a pimp in order to be safe. And so yeah, like it fucking sucks, but like where's the actual problem coming from? I do think like the incidence of streetwalkers is like much higher, or like people forced into it is a much lower percentage than what actually exists because it's the most visible. Like there's a huge amount of sex workers right now that are operating online. Like you just have online ads. We finally hit the point where we have online ads that are outside of U.S. jurisdiction, so it's more difficult to take down. So people can actually use them to safely meet and screen clients. A lot of like the blacklist sites have to be done in secret because these are the ones that escorts use to screen clients for each other. But you have to do it secretly because the U.S. will take it down. Mm-hmm. So we are like managing to operate safely despite the government's attempts to prevent us from operating safely.
Shamika, to your questions.
Well, I hate that I haven't been here. Let me apologize. But I went to your website and I was thinking, oh my God, this is not the crackhead prostitutes that I'm used to seeing. And it's just so organized. And I guess you all have already talked about like how much money you actually make.
Not really. I threw a number out there once, but no, we didn't talk about that.
Like, so do women really make money? And I asked that because I was having a conversation earlier today where this guy was telling me about his friend. They were in Atlanta and the girl is supposed to be a professional and she sent like these videos of her performing oral sex and he had to send her $100 before she would even come out. And I was thinking, surely that's the just deposit. Because I know it ain't nobody doing oral sex for only $100. Like you got to be making more than that. And the only reference I have is Pretty Woman, where he says, how much for the whole night? And she's like, me, you can't afford it. Mm-hmm. And he just dropped it. How much do these girls make? Like top of the line?
It depends on the city you're in, the country you're in, like the legislation. There's like a wide variety. Like in smaller cities, you can charge a lot less. I would say the median is maybe $200 an hour. In bigger cities, it's like up to $400 to $600 an hour. When I started working, I was doing around $1,200 an hour, and now I kind of do it as a hobby.
More like it.
Yeah, I do 3,000 an hour.
Male rose. Like, have you seen that device? The male rose.
The male rose?
Yeah, so the female toy that they have out and they call it the rose. Yeah. It's like, so now they have a male one, I guess, out. And I'm like, if you're doing that, that got to be more than $100. So $1,200, I guess, would sound about right.
Yeah, I mean, it depends. It's a supply and demand market. A little bit ironically, the prices in the US are higher, and this is very likely because it's so illegal. If you go to other places like Europe where it's decriminalized or like semi-legalized, you can't get away with charging rates that high. You have to charge much lower. It reduces the incentive to join sex work when the rates are lower.
So on the spiritual aspect, so do you have like any spiritual views? Like, do you feel like this is a connection with someone else, or is just literally no type of tie, you feel like?
It depends a lot on the person. I'd say with probably 80% of guys, I feel like the way that they're approaching the connection is much closer to a date. Like, it's like almost like a Tinder date hookup where I just happen to know that I'm going to have sex at the end. And I like that a lot. I'm careful, like I'm like guarded in the ways that I need to be in order to be protected. Like I don't like bare my soul and fall in love with every single person, but I try to carefully monitor the way that I feel. And if I feel like I actually do have space to connect with you in like a genuine way, that I do fall a little bit in love with people. And I really like that. I love the times where I'm like in bed with someone after we just had sex and I can feel that part of me that you just like kind of see it in their soul for a second. Like even though it's like a brief connection, it's still really intimate. And I really, really like that.
Wow, I'm not gonna keep hogging the conversation.
Well, I got a Shamika like question, something that I could think. Sometimes I have to think like Shamika. So you talk about how you screen for safety and how you like Shamika was saying in your writings about the things you do for precautions and to make sure that you vet people and things of that nature. But that is probably I'm assuming mostly from um, a safety perspective and see if it's the right fit, see if they can pay the money, see if they're not police officers, all that kind of stuff. How do you deal with the fact that humans by nature have all these differences, and when you're having sex with different people, you got to deal with all, you know, uh, I'm channeling Shamika. You got to deal with all the nasty. What do you do when they smell bad, or when they're sweaty, or when you,
Right.
when you got to deal with all that, and
Yeah,
all
the
that kind
feet
of stuff.
stink, or
Yeah,
they did number two and didn't
and they
shower
didn't clean
after.
themselves and all that, but
So
they're
you got
paying.
that faint shit smell that's as
I
they
got her
start to
going
move
now.
around. Yeah. How do you deal with that?
I actually rarely run into that. And I think it's probably because I'm charging such a high price point and I just mostly see people who I like. So it's like pretty rare. Occasionally it does. The thing is, like right now, the way I escort is very different from the way I used to. I used to escort like for like my money. That was like my full-time job. That was my income. And now it's like a hobby. I don't even have listed ads. I
It's a hell of a
don't
hobby.
it's like I don't have to. I'm at the point where like I make money through other stuff. Like this is
Right.
it's sort of like occasionally on the side because I actually enjoy it.
Mm-hmm.
And so the attitude here. So now when I enjoy it, I'm like much more likely to express my preferences. I'm like, hey, I just don't like that because I'm here to have fun, and if I'm not having fun, it's not worth it. I don't care. Get out. But when I was working for like a full-time job, I was much less likely to express when I didn't like something. Like at one point, there was a guy who I really liked. He was a wonderful client, but we were making out and there's something in his breath that just smelled real off, and I didn't tell him. I was just like, okay, you have to just power through it, be really into it, because I don't want to ruin the mood. He was like really horny and you don't want to break it. I could have told him though, it would have been fine. I'm just passive sometimes.
Mm.
Yeah, so when you screen them, I saw somewhere where you said you can send pictures, but you don't have to. Like, do you need to see what they look like in order to have an attraction? Because I remember being 19 and there was like this big drug dealer in the city who really, really liked me. And he offered me $2,000 to be with him. First of all, at 19, you would think, oh, $2,000, I can do that easy. But his nickname, I probably shouldn't say it, but his nickname would tell you exactly what he looked like. And
King Kong.
I just couldn't go through with it.
Monkey
Like,
face.
even for $2,000 at 19 years old, like if I don't have some sort of attraction, I can't just go through the motions. Like, are you able to just go through the motions? Like, does your body still respond as if this was somebody that you actually were attracted to?
Yeah. Yeah, for me, I don't have a problem with that. I totally understand. I get other people like having an issue with that, but for some reason, the way I'm wired doesn't matter. I've had sex with people that would be considered like extraordinarily unattractive.
Oof.
But I don't mind. I like pretty like appearance independent. Like
Mm.
I don't really care what somebody looks like. Like as much I'm maybe it's fucking cheesy, but like when somebody writes me like a good message and they seem like competent and smart, like that's it. All I need is that. I do have problems with guys who just feel like they're the hobbyists. It's like this class of escort of clients that do the whole like gotta catch 'em all Pokemon style, and it's
Mm-hmm.
less about like finding the favorite girl that you have a connection with, and more like, all right, guys, let's compare. Like, oh, I saw this girl, and she was like Brazilian and had a huge ass, and like this girl, she like charges way lower rates than how cheap she is. Like they're trying to do that. Whenever I get hobbyists, I just don't. I have a really hard time being physically attracted to them.
I guess one question that ties into all this, is there like, when you were doing this full time, is there a typical client? Like, is there one sort of guy that would mostly get in contact or that would be into doing this? Or is it really just men across the spectrum?
There's a couple different categories. Like in my category, there's like the businessman who's too busy to date. He's like traveling all the time. He's like a CEO or startup person, and he's just like, I have like 2 nights in town and I don't have the time to go on a Tinder date. And like maybe I'm gonna get laid, maybe I don't. There's like that guy, and usually those guys are cute and successful. And I'm like,
That's the pretty woman type.
There's a what?
Yeah. That's the pretty
A
woman
pretty woman
type.
type.
Yeah.
Yeah, I like those. There's also the older man who's been in a marriage for like way too long. His wife hasn't had sex with him for many years and he loves her and he doesn't want to ruin his life, but he's like desperate for a sexual connection with anybody. So he's like picking an escort because that's like a segmented thing. Like he can go see an escort and she's not gonna like ruin his life. He's not like having an affair with anybody at work. Um, and there's like the young inexperienced guy. Usually these are guys who are like programmers or like new into money, and they're usually like quite like physically unattractive or really socially awkward. Like the virgins tend to be this type, and they just like want an escort because they want like sort of some experience with a girl to like demonstrate to themselves that they like still got it, or they're just really lonely. um and then there's the hobbyists, the guys that I don't like, the ones that are just like, let's get them all. Usually those guys do like clothing requests. They don't really want to talk to you that much beforehand. They like have very specific positions that they just like put you in. They go through a routine, and you're like, okay, I feel like a blow up doll that's just sort of like doing the thing that you want, and then you leave, and it's like I could have been interchangeable with anybody. But those are generally like the categories of clients that I get.
Well, I've been in a relationship and felt like a blow up doll. So
no,
I guess if you're getting some money for it, it makes it all better.
it does.
Is it Horseface Killer?
Horseface Killer?
Is that his nickname? The drug dealer's nickname?
No, but it involves two animals. Two animals.
Wow.
One of them is
just
really
one would be a bad sign when you think about it. I mean, that's all you need, bro.
Oh man, that's just crazy. Oh, anyway, okay. So I wanted to get to the research then. How did you decide to start pulling in data and start to find out how people relate sexually?
I'm just really curious. I started like maybe 10 years ago, and it was like my first surveys were terrible. I like did a survey where I was like, it was kind of like a BuzzFeed survey because I want to know about other cam girls' habits because I was a cam girl at the time. And I did the survey and I got, a couple hundred responses of data. And then I realized as I was looking at it, like, wow, I asked all these questions like actually pretty bad. Like I don't actually know how to interpret this. So I'm like, okay, let's do it again. I did another survey, and then like that was a little better. But then I'm like, oh wait, now that I have this data, and then just rinse and repeat. And then it just started expanding, and like my followership started growing. So more people started taking my surveys. And then I started coming with new things to survey, and I kept like realizing that I was asking questions poorly. So it's just been like 10 years of like making constant mistakes and slowly fixing the mistakes as I make them. Now we're here, and I'm still making mistakes. I'm still fixing them, but at least I'm making like far more advanced mistakes than I was when I first started.
What do you think your most interesting poll was? The thing that you've learned the most from?
Well, like there's Twitter polls, and then there's like my other research.
Right.
And so there's some interesting Twitter polls. Like I like the one where it's like if you close your eyes and you imagine a circle with like a pie slice of it is like 20% yellow and the rest of it 80% is red. And you flick the spinner and it slowly lands on a color. What color did it land on? And if you ask people this, 20% of people say yellow and 80% of people say red, roughly. So you give or take a few percent. And that's one of my favorite Twitter polls. But in my data, there's a couple I did like the rape spectrum survey where I asked people like what counts as rape. Because there's like a lot of like really confusing gray area scenarios. Like what if one partner's drunk and the other isn't? And like what if they agreed to sex beforehand, but then one of them got drunk? Or like what if they just met each other? Like what if the man is drunk? Like there's a whole bunch of variety. Like what if somebody's very wealthy has sex with somebody who's not wealthy, or like somebody who's very smart?
Rape.
Like there's a lot of these unclear scenarios. So like I have a spectrum based on like the least rapey to the most rapey. Or like that one.
So how in your polls, how many people do you find, or women, who have a sexual fantasy of being raped? or like? Yeah, I'll start with that question.
Roughly 20%.
She's gonna pull it up.
Yeah. Sorry, I'm gonna pull up my chart here. I can link it to you also.
Yeah.
Well, while you're figuring that out, the next question would be, how many women do you think like some type of abuse but didn't realize it until it was actually done? Like, do you find that people have these certain fetishes or kinks that they kind of stumble upon and they didn't know they like it until they actually tried it?
So I haven't done a ton of research onto like the way fetishes are discovered. I have measured like the age at which fetishes onset, and some fetishes onset a lot earlier than others. Fetishes that onset earlier tend to be more extreme.
Wow.
The answer is probably yeah, though. I mean, I'm sure Ella knows at least as much, but there are whole books about that, like Her Secret Garden, or that's what she said, where people like ask hundreds of men and women about all these fantasies. And there's this idea, like we were talking about this earlier, that like certain things about sex are bad or dirty. I don't like, I'm not gonna make my like amoral, like conversational speech, but like a lot of this stuff just seems to be human nature. Like they're really common human fantasies for good or ill. Like the 20% for the rape or non-consent fantasy is really typical. It's 20 to 40% in every survey I've ever seen. It's actually higher for women than for men, which I guess is good.
Significantly.
Yeah.
I just found my data, and it's at least this one is a lower sample size. This is only like 40,000 people, but it was 32% of women reported interest in rape play.
Oh, wow.
As receiving it.
Mm.
Which is one of the actually really interesting things. For contrast, only 11% of men are interested in giving rape play. So, like around 3 times as many women are interested in receiving rape play than men are in giving.
Yeah.
This is one of the big things that caused me to get into sexual fetish research, because like very early on, I discovered that there was this gap. Like around twice as many women are interested in being submissive as there are men interested in being dominant, and this like kind of holds for most kinds of like dom submissive sub kinks. I'm like, why is that? It's one of the most fascinating things. I don't yet have a very definitive answer.
Yeah, it doesn't
This
seem like
this
a lot
was
of men are into being dominant.
Well, it actually also really depends what you mean by dominant, though. Like, if you just ask guys, like, do you like to have dom sex in like the doggy or missionary position? Like, 90% of men will say yes. But I mean, like, if you ask, like, would you act out your girlfriend's rape fantasy given like the modern policing climate or something? Like, you get much, and I mean, like, Charles started laughing. I mean, like, there are reasons for this, but you get much lower answers for
Yeah,
that.
like
And
biting, that
yeah,
type
well,
of like leaving bruises.
well, I
Yeah.
think a lot of men are cool with that, but like the reason I'm talking about this is like this, in terms of the conversation with Ella earlier, is actually what myself and some of the guys on my social accounts were arguing about with feminists like 2 days ago. Like there was a discussion online about whether things like consensual choking in relationships are cool. And I just posted, like, you can do what you want as a consenting adult, but I think it's funny that a lot of trad and feminist women talking about this think it's always men requesting this. And this drew like a real conversation. No, but this drew like a real conversation. And then like this hysterical response, all from left-wing feminist women that I thought was really entertaining.
Right. And so, you're right that not today, more men would be like, no, not because so now you're going to have to find that out. Is it when the men say of the subset that say no, are they saying no because they're not into it? Or are they saying no? It's like, man, I'm not trying to catch a case.
No, I think it might be both. But I mean, I also just think that from everything I've read and just like in relationships, like if your partner asks you to act out a rape fantasy that would bluntly make her come really hard that she's into, as a guy, you're going to have to think about that. And there are a lot of women that seem to be really into that and down with that. So there's nothing really right or wrong about that if you're both grown up. But the idea that women are some sort of delicate, non-sexual creatures that need to be protected from the boys has just always struck me as weird. And now you're seeing that from the left and from the right. So like when she dropped her data and I said, that's cool. It's not because that's good or because it's evil. It's just because it's the same thing that people find every time they honestly ask adult women what they want.
Right.
So,
yeah,
talk to each other about sex if you're in a relationship. I mean,
yeah, and so many people though seem very comfortable with lying about it. Like you hear this I think it's a lie that, oh, women don't enjoy sex as much.
I've
Maybe
never
some
heard that
women
from a grown-up.
don't, but I don't think that that's the truth across the board. Like,
I
but
think
they act as if you're not supposed to.
it's probably true if you don't have real conversations. And often that's the man's fault as well. Like if you don't go down and you come in 2 minutes, like there's a limit to how much your girl's gonna feel. But I mean, if you as a woman feel that there are certain things you can't say, so I mean, you're in the 50% of the population that has some of these fantasies, you just want certain basic things, and you never communicate that. I mean, it's gonna be the guy in that situation is just gonna be totally confused. Like what's wanted or what's demanded, that's never going to be communicated. So
Right.
gonna suck for you guys.
It's
I
gonna
mean, I
suck
don't.
for them.
Well, it's gonna
They're
suck for
vocal.
both of you. It's gonna suck never to come for 30 years. And a
Yeah.
lot of couples are in this position. I've never met a woman that can't make herself have an orgasm in like 2 minutes. So
Yeah.
you don't want to have to hand walk your guy through that. But if you don't explain some of the basics, like this is what makes me come, my stuff's a little more complicated, like once early
Right.
on, you're going to be in that weird situation where he might take 20 to do that basic thing, and sex with him is going to become kind of a chore. When
Right.
this is really something you guys can work through together pretty easily, and then sex will be good. So again, talk to the person you're fucking. It makes sex better.
Yeah. It's strange that a lot of people can't talk. And I'm like, how can you pop your legs open, but you can't have a conversation? Like that makes no sense to me.
Yeah, there's a lot of shame around it. Like when I first started having sex coming out of a really conservative culture, I was like had kinks. I was like, oh, I want to be tied up, but I was so ashamed of it. I couldn't tell my boyfriend that at all. I went years. And it was like so intense and oppressive. But it feels so real when it's happening. Like the shame, I mean.
Mm.
And it's weird that these things are so common, and a lot of them, because we're all grown-ups from big cities, are so mundane. Like being tied up isn't even at the rape fantasy level. That's something literally
I know.
half of men and women are into. It's just
Yeah.
if you can't communicate stuff at that level, you're gonna have really bad, really vanilla sex for a very long
Mm.
time. And a lot of
Right.
people, and this is the same thing for like what is it, 40% of men don't go down. Like it a lot of that stuff, that's where people are still if you're still working through stuff at that level, there are going to be some relationship issues. So
Right.
gotta
Especially if your
get
partner
on that.
has been out there and experienced some other things, you know.
Well, that's that combo because I mean, people right now are all over the sexual spectrum. So I mean, if you are still at that, I'm thinking about trying BDSM or giving head for the first time level, and your partner's body count is 80. I mean, the cheating in that relationship is predictable. It's not that there's something wrong with either one of you. It's just that if both of you haven't figured out your verbal and how to talk to each other, there's a
Right.
100% chance of you cheating on each other. So I
Right.
keep giving these like fucking like awkward endings, like so but it's obvious what's going to happen.
Right.
It's so
Right.
communicate.
So, what do you think? What is your next thing to try to research?
Well, I'm still going through my data. I did like a big survey that got a ton of responses and
Like ton,
huh?
as in what? Like almost a half a million? Don't
Yeah,
you have one
well,
that's like 400?
550,000 right now.
Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah.
That's big. Yeah.
Yeah, it's massive. And it's like mostly young women,
Mm.
or like by mostly, it's like heavily young women. There's a lot of other people too, but there's just sheer number, a lot of other people because the sheer number is so massive,
Right.
but
But it's
proportionally,
still mostly women in general, though, right?
it's
Or
like
is it
70% women. Yeah,
70? Yeah.
because it got shared because the survey is constructed such that you get a result at the end. And in general, like taking tests and getting results is something that's really preferred by young women traditionally.
Mhm.
Like if you go to like a BuzzFeed test takes or like Quizilla or like personalitytest.com, like it's all like the demographics of the people who frequent that are young ladies. So that's the demographics that I got are the test takers. But it's meant to be shared, so a lot of people shared it with their friends,
All right.
which helped.
Shanika, Will,
So
any last thoughts or questions?
Not really for me, no.
No, I should have been here earlier.
No, that's okay. Anything you want to leave us with, Ava?
uh
No.
I mean a lot of these things I have like lengthy blog posts on where I break down a whole bunch of the data, like
And
women's
what is
preference
that
for
again?
violent porn.
Worthlessness. What's the name of it again?
My blog, oh, it's just aella.substack.com, or my main website is knowingless.com.
Knowingless. I knew it was something less. Knowingless.com.
Knowingless, yeah.
Well, Aella, it's been great having you. Thank you for joining us. And
thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
From you commies who lame, no, you can't fuck with me. I got a country to save. God bless the US of A. Land of the free and a home of the brave. God get all of the praise. I got a country to save, cause I'm Patriot J and I'm saving it.